Hey kids, hey families, it's great to be back together. This week, we're back on the water. We're back on the water with the disciples in another boat at a different time. And this week, the story is still about a storm, but with a different impact on the lives of the disciples. So this week, I got to thinking that even though we're in New York City, we're surrounded by water, but a lot of us don't really get to it that often. It's harder to come to. In fact, it took me a good bit of effort to get this close to mine in the neighborhood. So really, it's like vacation time or a special occasion where we might be near the water on a beach or out on the water in the boat, right? This wasn't true for the disciples, though. They were really familiar with boats, and they were adept at being, in fact, working on the water. A good many of them were fisher people, and so that was what they did for a trade. They knew what to do on a boat. But when the storm came, and it did come, it shook them. It rattled them. In fact, it really scared them. And so I want you, with me, to think about those disciples and what they did when the fear came, when the storm was present. Let's listen to the story and watch what they do. This is a story about Jesus and Peter walking on water. It's coming from Matthew's Gospel. Jesus had spent the whole day teaching and preaching to a crowd of 5,000 or more folks. He had turned 5 loaves and 2 fish into a feast for all that were there. It had been a really full day. So just after that, Jesus asked the disciples to get into a boat. He said, "Go on ahead of me to the other side. I'm going to say goodbye to all the people gathered here." When Jesus had dispersed the crowds, he went up to the mountaintop to pray. Now, by the time it was evening, the disciples were in the boat out in the middle of the sea, and Jesus was alone on the land. But back with the disciples, the wind was blowing against them. It was fierce. The boat was being tossed about by the waves. The sea was raging, and the disciples were struggling against it. That next morning, early, Jesus looked and saw the disciples pulling hard on the oars. He went to them, walking on the water. The disciples were terrified. One said, "It's a ghost!" And they all cried out in fear. But immediately, Jesus spoke to them. He said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered, "Lord, is it really you? Because if it is, tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," Jesus said. So Peter got out of the boat. He walked on the water to Jesus. And all of a sudden, he started to notice the strong wind. And then he got scared. And then he began to sink. He cried out, "Jesus, save me!" Right away, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. Jesus said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind quieted. The sea stilled. Everyone in the boat stopped what they were doing and worshiped. The disciples said, "Jesus, you really are the child of God." So did you pay attention to those disciples and what happened to them when the storm came? What did they do? Well, the first thing that I really caught was that when the storms came, it was in the evening, and Jesus came out to them to help them in the morning. So what does that mean? That means that they had successfully fought against this fierce storm all night long. And who did they depend on for it? Each other. Their know-how, their skill, and their routines, what they had been trained to do, came into the forefront of their minds, and they made it work. That's pretty miraculous against a big-time windstorm that kicked up the seas against them. And then I think about what Peter did, right? When he saw Jesus walking towards him, and he was pretty terrified, just as terrified as being of this storm on the water, he says, "Jesus, is that you?" Right? Where is God in this moment of terror that we experience? That's what Peter knew to do as a person of faith. "Jesus, is that you?" And when he got confirmation and then heard the words of Jesus say, "Come," he listened and he followed Jesus's words. It's what he knew to do. The routine kicked in as a person of faith. He followed, and he was successful in that moment. But when did the disciples react to the storms, to the fears, and not to their routines, and not to their faith, not to what they knew? It's shown when Peter is walking on the water doing this miraculous thing, and in an instant, he shifts his focus not on what's working, but to the wind and to the water and to that fear inside of him. Though real, it overwhelms the faith, it overwhelms the work, and he starts to sink. But what I notice, my friends, is that even in the successes and the sinkings, Jesus is there with them. Jesus sees the disciples from the shore and sees that they're struggling with that boat and goes to them. And here, Jesus, when Peter sinks in front of him, reaches out his hand after he's called to, grabs on, catches him, and lifts him up to the boat, to safety. We're gonna sink, and we're gonna succeed, and Jesus will be there for both. Friends, think with me about a time in your life when something pretty miraculous happened. When you did something with friends or family or community, with helpers that you couldn't have possibly done on your own, like those disciples against the windstorm all night long. How'd it feel? And then think with me about a time when you sank, when your fear and the work that you had to do overwhelmed you, and you couldn't rely on your routine or your training or even your faith. Think about how that felt too. Friends, in both cases, Jesus is there. And Jesus is ready to pick us up in our successes and in our sinkings. Let's go to God in prayer. Loving one, you meet us on the lake shore, on the sea, in the storm, or in the calm. You never abandon us. You help us to train our hearts and our minds on you, to look to you when we need help, and to look to those other helpers along the way, who together in community we can create miraculous things. God, we thank you for these stories when we can connect to the disciples and learn again that you are with us always, even when the storms hit. Amen.